record button on this. The record on that's already going. Okay. Today on the Leon Drury podcast, we have with us David Tiller. David, I've known for some time. I think when I first met David, I was working for Hawker de Havilland at one stage, and he came out with another colleague who'd been on this podcast, Fraser Nelson, and are implementing competency standards. So, David, I might just let you do a little bit of introduction about who you are and who you work for, where you come from.
Okay, I actually work for the Australian Industry Group, but getting to the position that I'm actually in, I actually started probably going almost 27 years ago. I actually started with the MTIA, Metal Trades Industry Association, before it became known as the Australian Industry Group after it merged with the Chamber. I actually started with the MTIA on a 12-month contract to help organisations implement what was known back in those days as ISO 9000 accreditation. And because of my background, toolmaker by trade, mechanical engineer by first profession, at that particular time, the industry parties, being the MTFU and the MTIA, were implementing what was known as the structural efficiency principle. And one of the things with the structural efficiency principle was to put a skills-based classification structure into the metal industry award at that time, and that to be supported by competency standards. We had a lot of great people working for the organisation, very, very technical around industrial relations, this, that and the other. But because of my background, actually doing the work, I got tapped on the shoulder and said, Dave, is there any chance that you can actually give us a bit of a hand with this project of implementing competency standards? And I've spent the last 27 years actually trying to pass that on to somebody else, if that makes sense. And also at that particular time, there was a government grant for a whole load of advisors with the industry parties to go out and help them implement competency standards. But because I wasn't actually one of those advisors, I could actually go and do fee-for-service work in that particular area. And then it grew, then I started getting into the policy area, then starting to get involved in editing units of competency and, the discussions around the values of units of competency. That's the short story. The short story. The very short story.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning then about your trade. Where did you do your trade, your apprenticeship?
I'm sort of born and bred in the Hawkesbury. Well, actually not born in the Hawkesbury area, but definitely bred in the Hawkesbury area. Like a lot of people at that particular time, bailed out of school at 16 years of age. Started an apprenticeship in a contract tool room, located not that far from where we are today, in Parramatta. A contract tool room, sort of specialising in the plastics and die casting area.
All right.
Did my apprenticeship there. When I finished my apprenticeship, I spent a short period of time with them. Then moved on into other organisations. Ended up finding my role in operations area, looking after the operations, production, maintenance of a few organisations, and then. Packed up and did a bit of world travel and came back and didn't have a job and saw an advert in the newspaper for the MTIA and applied for that job and been there ever since. Had a little sabbatical in the middle there where went back to the real world.
So was that role with the MTIA, was that an industrial role or what was the role that you went for there?
It was a government grant, and it was given to the MTIA to employ just a few people across the country to help organisations write policy and write procedure around quality accreditation at that particular time.
Okay.
What was a big movement back then. If you didn't have quality accreditation, it was very hard to get government.
So ISO type quality?
That's what it would be known as now.
Yeah.
Sort of the ISO 9000.
Yeah.
But back then it was known as the 3900 series standards.
Okay.
Right. So
standards seems to be in your blood now. Like you've been around training package standards now for a long time as well. What sort of, and you spoke about the the changes in the 90s and so on, where you started to get involved in that. What was the impetus from the MTIA, or was it the AI group by then?
It was the MTIA, and that was the structural efficiency principle, as it was known at that particular time. Was a compact between the federal government at that particular time and the ACTU, where we had to go around and do some award restructuring. And one of the key changes in the award restructuring was to move away from a classification structure that tended to focus on tasks that people did and also time spent in industry, where it was to actually sort of implement these competency standards as well. And of course, the competency standards at that particular time were also driving the changes in the vocational educational system as well.
Yeah. So competency standards sort of started with medals, yeah? So this has been an interesting thing for me for my last 10 years in this role, about how industry's been dragged kicking and screaming into, and I'm not saying necessarily medals in engineering, but there's still been a bit of a hangover about people not understanding what competency means and what competency standards even mean. What's your view on the way that's been implemented? Was it implemented properly initially to allow industry to understand, and for the people who are supposed to be partners in that, training organisations, were they educated well enough at the time and over the last 20 years about how to implement competency standards?
One of the key things that I noticed, especially in the really early years, especially in the vocational area, where TAFEs, TAFEs have always done a great job, but a lot of their curriculum, as it was known at that particular time, didn't necessarily reflect what industry wanted. So when we went around sort of, looking at all the key tasks that were happening in industry, matching that to units of competency, it was probably for the first time that it was actually starting to be driven by industry, not necessarily actually being driven by what was actually happening in the learning institutions at that particular time.
Right.
So what I noticed at that time, there was tending to be just a little bit of pushback.
Yep.
Right, where it was this, they'd have really good training programs that were actually being delivered, but they weren't necessarily what was actually required in industry. And one of the other things that it really noticed was it was actually sort of putting a lot of sort of honesty into the system. And what I meant by honesty is that, if I take my own apprenticeship, for example, I went down to TAFE, I was working in plastics injection, and I had to make a tiny little press tool. I made this little press tool, put a little bit of brass in it, sort of, hit it, and they say, congratulations, Dave, you can actually now manufacture press tools. I never saw one in industry, and actually have a piece of paper to say that I can actually do that.
Yeah.
So one of the key changes is that, what you were actually doing as part of your apprenticeship was what you were actually being taught at TAFE.
Yeah.
And there was a little bit of, friction, in that, and about, developing training plans. So the training plans actually really had to reflect what was actually happening in the workplace.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted flexibility, and then everybody got flexibility, and then everybody then turned around and said it'd be really nice if we can actually have a little bit of structure as well.
Yeah.
The bit of the nature of the beast in that particular area.
So there's been, and look, the flexibility thing has been playing, I guess, a role over the last 10 years that I've been in this job. Unfortunately, we hadn't seen the flexibility being used that was available in particularly the Metals and Engineering Training Package. And in recent times, there's been some changes to sort of streamline bring the qualifications back to their main purpose. Could you give us any insight into that as to why that has happened?
I'm not 100% sure I actually got the question there, Leon. We've always had a big bucket of units of competency.
Yeah.
And, if you take the mechanical trade, for example, you can go to some organisations, and the person's very much a maintenance person, and they might actually be doing some fluid power.
Yeah.
And then you could go to another organisation, and it's the same qualification, but they're doing a lot of machining, and they might not be doing any fluid power.
Yeah.
So that becomes a real challenge on actually how to deliver that.
Yeah.
Right. We always had that flexibility. And we still have that flexibility now.
Yep. So, and what I was getting at was basically there was an opportunity, and I'd seen in the past that some of the qualifications were being manipulated by people who were unable to access funding in some of those qualifications, and the fabrication trade is probably the one that comes to mind for me. I know in North Queensland there were some people who were basically looking to fund industrial painters apprenticeships, but they weren't funded in Queensland at the time, and they were then using the fabrication trade to get the funding support as well as get the skills. And the people who were coming out when that flexibility was available weren't fabricators. They were industrial painters. So there would be a bit of confusion for industry when someone would turn up with a qualification that said fabrication, but primarily they were industrial painters. They couldn't do any fabricating. Was that a driver at all towards, bringing down, I guess, the elective pools in the MEM?
The elective pools, in a lot of cases, where we actually went back and actually looked at some of the units of competency, and we were looking for the take-up of those units of competency. Yep. If there wasn't a high take-up of those units of competency, the question then got asked, do we actually need to actually keep that within the trainee package? Yep. A lot of people have viewed the trainee package as actually being quite complex. Yeah. So if there's a unit of competency that's never been accessed, it shouldn't actually be there. Yeah. The industrial painters, that's always been a question about which trainee package is appropriate for them. Yeah. And sometimes that actually go back to award coverage as well. Okay. Whether they're in the construction area or whether they're actually supporting manufacturing.
Okay. Yeah. So. I remember a job that we went to once out in Orange, and I won't name the organisation, but we're talking about looking at people's work and classifications and so on. Can you tell us anything about that sort of work that you've done in the past, about going out and looking at how you reclassify workers and what the standards are that you follow when you do that?
So if I take my role with AI Group around using competency standards for classification purposes, it's a spectrum. Yeah. Down one end of the spectrum, there's a blue in the workplace to determine where the person actually sits within the classification structure, and we're using competency standards to determine how many points that person gets, therefore how much money that gets paid. Right up at the other end of the spectrum is where we're actually using competency standards to bring about organisational change. Yeah. Right. Because it can fit into so much, it can actually fit into the recruitment, training plans, all of that type of stuff. Some really good stuff can actually happen at that end. More often than not, the work that I tend to do in this area is where it's a dot point in an enterprise agreement, where the parties agree to implement competency standards in the life of this agreement. Right. And I tend to get the phone call usually when there's about a month to go until the enterprise agreement expires, just the nature of the beast. Yeah. We stick very, very closely to the implementation guide, and the implementation guide says that there's a 5-step process that needs to be followed. Right. Step number 1 talks about consultation. I don't like calling it step number 1 because you've actually got to consult all the way through the process. Yeah. So we're sort of talking to the industry, talking to the parties at the enterprise. I said you need to come up with a committee for a better name, and we need to have management representatives and employee representatives on that committee. Yeah. And they become the conduit to everything else within the business. Yeah. We would then provide either a briefing session or a one-day training session to the group, so everybody has a good understanding on how it actually all works. Yeah. So that's step number 1, and then step number 2, it's called task analysis, right? And that is where we would look at the business and then we'd break it down into different areas. So, say for example, we might have production, warehousing, fabrication, mechanical, and electrical. And in each one of those areas, we then go and identify all of the key tasks that are actually being carried out in each one of those functions. Yeah. So we're not actually really focusing on the people at that stage, we're focusing on the job. Yeah. Right. And then we would get agreement on what all of those key tasks are. Right. And there's also an opportunity at that stage to do what's sometimes known as sort of, job redesign. well, we might not be doing it now, but we might want to be doing it in the future. An example of that is that we're thinking about introducing PLCs or digital
different technologies of sorts.
Different technologies. They might not have it at that particular time, but they're looking into the future.
Yeah, so we're looking at something at the moment like the diploma of applied technologies. So that's a real about sensor systems and so on like that. So you might be looking at a diploma level type. What's that in the classification levels? Is that a C6?
C5. Sort of diploma sits at C5, but they might be doing more than a diploma. So an advanced diploma sits at C3.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So we would identify all of that.
Yep.
Get agreement on that. So then the next stage, and it's often the quite a challenging stage for industry, not necessarily for people like myself, is then matching those key tasks to the units of competency.
Yeah.
Right. And we have lots of units of competency out there.
Yeah.
And my advantage is that I've sat around editing committees and and even understand the intent behind a lot of those units of competency and why they were actually developed.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's thousands of pages and and I can just hone in on one particular thing and they go, well, how did you know that? And I go, well, that's because that's what I do.
Yeah. So
we then would match all of those key tasks to those units of competency, and also have a bit of a discussion around would you actually see that unit of competency as potentially being post trade or actually part of the trade?
Yeah.
Because there's lots of quirky little rules around, right? And then we would develop a profile.
Yeah.
Right. So up to and including that stage, purely been focusing on the job. Right. It takes a little bit of time, get everybody to agree on that.
Yeah.
And then we then go into what's called step 4, and it's actually called skills audit.
Yeah.
There's lots of different ways about going about doing it. The way that we sort of tend to do it when we're doing this in a classification context is self-assessment called by validation. So small groups of people would come together, that they would get a self-assessment document. They would actually go through that document, we'd facilitate that, and they would indicate whether they actually hold the skill and whether they use the skill at that organisation. So that's very much their input to it. And we would also ask them, if you believe that you're doing something that's not covered, let us know because we might have actually missed something.
Yeah.
Right. Then there's validation, and it's peer validation. So we go back to the committee. So there'd be employee management representatives on the committee. Let's just say that you filled your self-assessment document in and said, Leon says that he programs PLCs. Do we agree with that or disagree with that?
Yeah.
Sometimes that might be a long conversation. Sometimes it might be a short conversation.
Yeah.
And if we agree, we would nominate the points. If we don't agree, we wouldn't nominate the points. But there's still always an opportunity for that to be challenged and potentially a full-blown work assessment actually being done on that.
Yeah.
Then we get to step 5. We would add the points up and determine somebody's classification.
Yeah. So, the points issue is quite a key one, and it's something that I've confronted over the years with training organisations because they wed their points to the way they structure an apprenticeship and so on at C3 and C4 and for the advanced engineering trade and so on. And a lot of them have looked at how many hours of training that allocates, but really it's an industrial instrument, isn't it? The points are allocated really to reclassify people in effect.
The points are the value for the unit of competency.
Yeah.
It's not for the amount of time that's actually spent in there.
Yeah.
It's probably fair to say that there's a bit of a correlation between the two.
Yeah.
Right. The way that sort of worked out originally, a lot of people say, well, why have you got a 2-pointer or a 4-pointer? And why did we start up with, why did you start with 96 points?
Yeah.
Is because before the introduction, you actually spent 960 hours at TAFE, although that varied a little bit. And each module was a nominal 40 hours, even though that tended to get knocked back to 38 hours. So that became a starting point where we looked at modules, and that sort of roughly equated to 4 points.
Yeah.
But that was always a starting point.
Yeah.
You look at some units of competency, right? And take forklift, for example, that's worth 4 points. And we're saying that, the time that she spent for that one would be significantly different to, say, somebody who was doing, what used to be known as hydraulics 1 or pneumatics 1.
Yeah.
Around the 4 points. Right? But it's always been a starting point.
Yeah.
And we still get asked that question nowadays, where somebody might import a unit of competency and they would go, well, what value would you put on that? I would always originally go to the Victorian Purchasing Guide, where they actually nominate the number of hours, and that would become a starting point.
Okay.
Well, I'd look at that and I go, okay, they're allocating 4 points. What's the value of that? Is it around about 4 points? Sometimes it could be a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less.
So with the Victorian Purchasing Guide, for the people that don't understand, that's sort of, most of the country follow that in some way around, funding apprenticeships and traineeships and the amount of hours that are allocated. And in New South Wales, we've seen a significant decline in the number of hours that are now available for face-to-face teaching in this state. I won't go down the rabbit hole of all the politics around the funding model, but we're now looking at about, 680, I think, is what they're currently looking at face-to-face delivery. And even, in the effect of, and just to touch on the competency issue, people had talked about, when competency standards came in and competency came in, that it was shortening the trade, and because it used to be a 4-year trade in the apprenticeship model, but because of the process of the way TAFE is probably the main RTO, the way they were delivering it was basically in a 36-week program, which effectively made it 3 years, not 4 years. So people were being made competent in 3 years, not in 4 years, even though that's a nominal term for the apprenticeship, and it remains so. So there's, I guess, a little bit of a misunderstanding about the hours and the purchasing guide and all the politics that go along with how long it takes an apprentice to come out as a fully qualified tradesperson. But the role that you'd been doing around competency standards in enterprises is really about recognition, yeah?
Yeah, very, very much about the recognition. So, and sometimes people need a little bit more time to actually pick up a particular competency, and other people could actually pick it up in a slightly lesser time.
Yeah.
Right? Because of the flexibility and funding and all those types of things, we're still sort of very focused on trying to maintain the standard. We've never wanted to sort of the standard of a tradesperson. Say it's the goalposts, it's actually set.
Yeah.
Right. And we put words around that to describe that.
Yeah.
Right? Not always easy for RTOs and other organisations to interpret that. Right? So sometimes nominal hours and other things have actually been suggested to sort of put that as a minimum standard.
Yeah.
Right? In that particular example. Right, and another example of that, and I know that it's been quite topical over the last 12 months, hours and all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
But if you think of the driver's license, originally there was no time allocated to a driver's license. You just turned up, you did the license. It was treated very much as an event.
Yeah.
Right, and if you managed to pass the test, you actually got a license. And that changed over the years to now a logbook actually being put into place, and that logbook actually having nominal hours around particular tasks.
Yeah.
And that was always the minimum, right, with what was looked at before the person actually went for it, right?
Yeah.
And that can be challenged. Especially if you had somebody who, from a very, very young age had been sort of, driving on the farm and this, that and the other, and then the question is, well, why do they need to spend all of that particular time? Could there be a recognition process in the place?
Yeah.
Right? So that's the challenge that we've always had, is to maintain the integrity of that qualification.
Yeah.
Right? Maintain the integrity of the trade. We've had some people, who go along and, working for an organisation, where you could probably say there's probably not a trade there, but they're actually falling out with the trade, and that's a disservice for the apprentice, and it's also a disservice to the industry.
Yeah. So in recent times, we've heard an announcement with MEM Revision 2 that now there's been an allowance made for MEM to say that all apprenticeships now need to be, all qualifications in the trade area need to be carried out while they're under a contract of training or an apprenticeship. This took some time, didn't it, to get through, because there's been debate around the states and territories about the value of that, and really the take I took on it was that it was really about quality and trying to guard the quality of the trade, and make sure that there was, enough experience and exposure given to any student that's engaged in those qualifications, so it gave industry some confidence. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Without going into all of the detail, it's about maintaining the integrity of that qualification. That qualification was if you go to the history of that qualification was put together for a tradesperson.
Yeah, it
was built around the apprentice for that. There's other pathways, being part of the IRC and also being, on numerous boards with MSA and MERS-ITAB before that over the years. There's always opportunity to come up with other qualifications and other pathways in that particular area, and always open to those ideas.
Yeah, so there's one that's, a burning one at the moment is around a pathway for school students, a pre-vocational pathway as well for people who might be unemployed and looking to enter into the industry. Is there any future opportunity for us to look at something like that, a pre-vocational qualification? I know there's the MEM, the manufacturing pathways qualification that's been created. In some states it's been taken up with vigour, and it hasn't so much been here. And my role in that in New South Wales, I've been continually approaching training services to add that to the skills list, but they haven't been ready to do so. And quite honestly, I haven't found much transparency of why they wouldn't do that, because it allows quite a bit of opportunity for people to learn skills, but not have the industrial implications that go along with having a Cert 2 that might give them advanced standing in an apprenticeship, for instance. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the pathways qualification was put together for exactly what you're talking about, right? As a pre-vocational qualification, moving from school into moving into industry.
Yeah,
right. But disappointing about the take up, and we hear different comments from time to time. If there's a problem with the qualification, just let the IRC actually know about it. We actually want to work, with these particular bodies. If there's something that's actually not quite right or something that's actually not working, let us know about it. The certificate 2 that we had that was being used for pathways as part of that qualification was never put together for that. That qualification was always put together for existing employees in the industry in a production environment for recognising the skills that those people actually already had in the workplace.
Yeah, mainly process workers.
Yeah, mainly process workers. Yeah, was actually being put together there. Yeah. So that unit that qualification was picked up in some areas and was used for not its original intent. Yeah. And that possibly was because there was nothing there to actually fill that particular gap. Yeah. There's no reason why we can't sort of look at things to actually fill that particular gap as well.
Yeah. So, and I guess there is quite a lot of interest at the moment around what people are describing as new jobs, and wanting different types of flexibility. And I know I'm working on a project at the moment with the Western Sydney Parklands Authority, I think they're called, around skill sets for people who are going into the Aerotropolis, to allow companies to rapidly upskill people, and that's not new really. There's been a lot of debate and discussion about micro-credentials that, unfortunately some people think they are an option instead of a full qualification. I think there's a lot of value add in that space, and OEMs have been doing this for a long time where they offer it commercially. It doesn't necessarily need to be funded out of the public funds to allow companies and individuals to upskill themselves in whatever the skill is that they're looking for. It's how those things, I guess, keystone into the existing system to allow people to upgrade and make their skills transferable. What are your views on micro-credentials?
It's very new, and there's a lot of confusion out there what we actually mean by a micro-credential. There's one view that micro-credentials are actually delivered by RTOs, and there's another view that micro-credentials don't have to be delivered by an RTO. They can be delivered by another training organisation, and they attach a credential to that. Right, example of, Microsoft have been doing it for years and years. You go off and do one of their training courses, and it's a micro-credential. Coming back to the RTO space, you could actually argue on one level it's always been there.
Yeah.
Right, there's nothing stopping somebody sort of, enrolling into 2 or 3 units of competency and actually getting a statement of attainment around those 2 or 3 units of competency.
Yeah.
Around that. There's different views out there. There's one view that is actually polarizing or taking apart a qualification. And then there's the other view that a good skill set actually can be used quickly, upskill somebody and be a great value there.
Yeah.
It's also there's industrial implications around that as well.
Yeah. So just, and I don't like to get into, because I can't give any advice around industrial relations, and maybe you in your role or your organisation can, and I'd suggest that anybody who is looking for any advice around the implementation of competency standards and industrial advice, that they do seek out the advice of AI Group. Where do you see the role of micro-credentials, impacting classification and possible pay outcomes?
It's probably a little bit too early to say how that actually will have an impact on. Yeah. The classification structures have always been put together around full qualifications. Right?
Yeah.
They haven't been put together around the micro-credentials and those things clicking in how it actually all comes together in that particular area there. That's on one view. Another view is that if you have somebody who say has already got a trade qualification and they're already classified appropriately to that qualification, well then a micro credential could be something that actually gets built on top of that.
Yeah.
And a good example is over the years we've had you've had tradesperson who's gone off and done fluid power, or they've gone off and done PLCs or done another welding course. If you actually called them a micro-credential, well, then the classification structure actually accommodates that.
Already.
It's probably more below the trade area where it's just not 100% sure how that's all actually going to come together.
Okay. What about the idea of a trade passport or something like that, where you can collect these credentials to build a qualification? Do you think that's an idea worth pursuing?
It's actually an idea that we actually spoke about many years ago. We actually spoke about having the passport, where they list all the units of competency and being signed off on those particular units of competency. The issue came there with the credibility of the person who's actually signing off on that, right? And that's why we always sort of tend to fall back that it was done by an RTO. You got the statement of attainment, and that's what's actually transportable. But you can have a passport, and you could have a credential, and it could be signed off by somebody. Then the question is, how credible is that?
Yeah,
and that becomes the issue. And working with organisations, I've seen sort of transcripts being put down in front of say HR managers, and they look at that and they go, yeah, that's not really worth the piece of paper it's written on. And then other times they look at that and go, well, that's a very credible organisation that's actually got value.
Yeah.
And they still run into the issue about currency as well. Somebody could go off and actually do that, but are they actually doing it in the workplace, and are they doing it regularly? So they actually hold that particular competency.
Yeah. So that's an interesting statement, I guess, about competency and how long competency can be held for. What do you have a view on that? On how currency is obviously one of the currency and validity and all those sort of things are the things that are addressed during assessment. But when employers are seeking to employ someone and they say, I want someone with a qualification, they don't generally look at their transcript too closely. They look at the qualification as the heading. What's your view around, someone who might have been wedded, let's say a fitter, and he's been working on a lathe for the last 20 years, but then he goes for another job in another organisation and they want him to be a maintenance fitter. How well is competency carried between those job roles, and is there a space for, I guess, skills update or some currency type training, whether it be through simulation or something like that? Do you think there's any value in that?
Quite a few questions wrapped up in that one. Going back, when you get a transcript or when you get a tick in a box, always saying is at that point in time you were competent.
Yeah.
Right? And sometimes that person will maintain at that particular level. They might actually increase or they actually might decrease.
Yeah.
I've still got a trade certificate somewhere at home. If I went back to the bench, I'd actually be dangerous.
Yeah.
Right? And then other people will have a qualification, and because they've actually been using it on a regular basis, it's still current.
Yeah.
Right? So it's about the questions that you actually, if you're working in HR and you're recruiting people, it's about going into a little bit deeper. Linking that to what I spoke about, sometimes we're using competency standards and potentially you can actually use it as a recruitment tool. That's where if you actually sort of identify your key tasks, match those to units of competency, you can actually turn that into a tool that you can actually use as part of the recruitment process.
Yeah.
For example, you might actually want somebody who can actually use a surface grinder, just for example, right? They might have had a transcript that had surface grinder on it, or they might have a transcript that doesn't have a surface grinder on it. But the question is, can you use a surface grinder, and can you give some examples of where you've actually used it in the industry?
Yeah. Right. So, and that probably leads me to another thought is in COVID times, we've lost a lot of people out of the aerospace industry who have been then looking for roles in other parts of industry. And I thought, because I've got that sort of background, they'd be great assets in a lot of organisations. How transferable are skills between, say, the aero skills sector and metals and engineering sector? Is that possible, that transfer of knowledge and capability?
My view is very much so. It's about reading, interpreting a drawing. It's about diagnostic tools. It's about using hand tools. Those types of things are very, 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 very transferable.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can get a really good mechanic who can actually be a really good maintenance fitter, and a very good maintenance fitter can actually be a very good mechanic. But I'm not saying that either of those could actually then become a very good maintenance electrician.
Yeah.
So it's got to be around the similar types of trades.
Yeah. And my understanding is as well, depending on the organisation that you work for, it has a certain type of culture and certain type of, I guess, archetypes that work within those cultures. Someone who worked in the aerospace sector will be very rules driven, very, they're guided by authority, whereas someone who might be working in a maintenance in a general factory somewhere who has a lot of autonomy and a lot of individual capability, they would work in a different way. So it might not go both ways, yeah?
Yeah, and it does go. I was doing a work, I won't mention the organisation, like a lot of units of competence, you'd say, select the appropriate hand tool, select the appropriate measuring equipment, all that type of stuff. And when you work in an organisation that's very, very rules-driven, they actually don't select because the standard operating procedure tells them what to select.
Yeah.
Where sometimes you say, well, the skill is to be able to look at a particular job and go, okay, what's the best way to actually go about tackling that?
Yeah.
When we got lots of policy and procedure, well, sometimes that's actually been taken away, and sometimes that diagnostic skill.
Yeah, and it's something I noticed with the oil and gas industry, for instance, or process manufacturing versus the metal trades. The metal trades is really focused on skill, whereas some of those other industries are very task-driven, and they basically don't have that autonomy, don't have that ability to make a decision for themselves about appropriate tooling and appropriate uses of things. So I think that's an interesting thing, particularly for the engineering and manufacturing training package, is that it builds a capability or a skill set that allows for the autonomy, whereas a lot of other training packages don't allow for that autonomy at all.
Oh, it's very much part of the metals training package, always has been.
Yeah.
It's about, welding on site is different to actually welding in the workshop.
Yeah.
But the unit of competency covers both.
Yeah. So in recent times as well, only 2 weeks ago, I think I was out at Lincoln Electric having a look at their facilities there, and they're a good example of a non-RTO training organisation. So they're expert in the welding industry. They supply and maintain equipment for welding of all levels. And the reason I was out there is because there's some work going on around virtual reality welders. There seems to be a bit of a trend in the training sector at the moment to implement VR because they see that there's an opportunity to, I've got to choose my words here carefully, but in some ways reduce the health and safety risks to make it more appealing for people to enter into the industry and to reduce the cost of delivery of training. Now, one of the concerns that I had was that, it's a bit misleading to put someone into a nice clean room with no smells, no heat, no possibility of being burnt to learn a skill that, in reality, when they actually need to have that skill, all those things are going to be there. And they've got a new, I don't know how new it is, but they've got another system which is called Real World, which blends that from virtual reality into applying it to an actual weld, so you get to feel the heat and the smells and all that sort of stuff, which I think is great. I talk to fabrication firms constantly, and they're saying they've got skill shortages all over the place. They just can't get people to come and either people that are good fits for their organisation or that are willing to apply for apprenticeship. So there's a real skill shortage out there for fabrication firms. What's your view on the VR stuff? Do you think there's a place for that, and how far can it be taken?
Oh, there's definitely a place for it, especially around workplace health and safety. You see that with flight simulators. Because of the nature of that. And just got to be careful that we don't go too far where it actually becomes so sterile when they actually then go and do it for real. They have no real idea. It's like people who play computer games all the time.
Yeah.
Right. They're very good at doing that, but then when it actually goes to reality, sometimes I really struggle in that particular area there. Yeah. The welding is a good example. That's quite different to actually being on site working at height and there's some wind behind you.
Yeah.
Right. It's about, that's what sort of gets built into competency is you have to be able to apply that competency, to different situations.
Yeah. And that was one of the real things that I think also had an impact on training packages was that we did have simulation at one stage in all the units, and the way simulation was being delivered was basically a demonstration of practice and an assessment, whereas those statements that were in there about a variety of situations, a variety of contexts, and we're talking about you have to perform in a pressure environment where you're having to supply to a customer to a level of quality that they're willing to pay for. So, to put someone through a training program and actually not simulate that to the level that they would be expected to perform in a real workplace was becoming a problem, wasn't it? And this is why we're seeing us chasing quality through, trying to manage how people will do their apprenticeship, for instance. So and the hours that were sort of nominated for a little while there to try and get MEMR through R2 through was trying to capture that, trying to say, well, we need to get exposure. We can't do this all in a quick 6-month or a weekend program. It actually takes time to develop these craft skills. Yeah.
Oh yeah, very much so. It's about actually doing it. In the workplace. Over a period of time, really until that people could say, well, I actually have this person actually do it for me.
Yeah.
And we got the assessment, and sometimes I see it's it's a tick and a flick.
Yeah.
And I often said that when we used to run the assessor training. Yeah. Where it's got to be treated very much as a process, not an event.
Yeah.
I can take my partner out to my parents' property. We can go into the little workshop that's there, and I could spend 20 minutes teaching her how to use the MIG welder and stick two plates in front and say run a weld, and she'd probably pass a lot of tests that I see actually being done.
Yeah.
But now actually give her one plate that's actually got a little bit of lead or phosphorus in it, and put a bit of wind in there. Run a weld, get 15 mil up there, and go something's wrong.
Yeah.
But a competent welder would actually then turn around and say, oh, there's some lead or phosphorus in there, and I've got to be able to do this, and I've got to be able to do that. And you can only pick that up with time. Yeah,
it's a depth of knowledge that's gathered over time, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is something, talking about Fraser Nelson before, I've had this discussion with him over some time about possibly the need for some material science type program to enlighten people about some of these things, and even behavioural type training of some sort that might have to be brought in to deal with the new environment, the new technologies, the new sorts of applications that are being applied in the modern workplace. Because there was a firm out in Western Sydney who had a lot of fabricators, and they introduced a lot of digital type fabrication machinery, and they thought it was fantastic. And it was great while you've got people who were traditionally trained and knew all the manual skills. My fear is that as that generation moves on, are the people who are going to come in and replace that generation, are they going to have the same capability and understanding about what the machinery is doing without that underpinning knowledge?
And that's one of the things we've really struggled with some of the units of competency.
Yeah.
If we take a lot of the CNC stuff, you've actually got a prerequisite unit of actually been able to use the machine tool manually.
Yeah.
And traditionally that's the way it was. You use the lathe, and then you progress from the lathe to actually get onto the CNC equipment.
Yeah.
But we're not seeing workplaces operating like that anymore.
Yeah.
Right. Where we're actually not even seeing conventional machine tools in there. It's just all CNC.
Yeah.
So what's actually been highlighted to us, we've actually now got a prerequisite, what's actually now been seen as an obstacle for that person actually getting that parent unit.
Yeah.
So the question then gets asked: do we actually take that prerequisite out of that prerequisite path?
Yeah.
Right. So the person can actually do it, or do we actually have to start changing the whole way that we actually work?
Yeah.
It's a tricky one. I don't know the answer to that one. We're definitely going through a transition period, and we're seeing that with a lot of the technology type stuff, where you've actually had to have the conventional stuff as a prerequisite for that. That's the way it worked.
Yeah.
But it's not the case anymore.
Yeah, that's been a hot topic as well, hasn't it? Prerequisites. I know from the training package development standards and so on, they've been trying to push out the need for prerequisites. They wanted units that had no prerequisites. Our industry, I'll talk about the manufacturing and engineering training package, relied heavily on prerequisites because they were the building blocks to those higher level skills. Is there any thought being put to super units perhaps, so that they remove prerequisites, so you have one block of learning? What impact would something like that have?
Like if I took the lathe unit, for example, not knowing every single prerequisite, you've got to be able to use hand tools, be able to read a drawing, got to be able to measure workplace health and safety, bit of mathematics, read and interpret a drawing. All of those types of things are prerequisites for that parent unit.
Yep.
Right. The question is, do we actually embed that in the unit, or do we list them as prerequisites?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. By actually embedding that in the unit, we're going to have a lot of content that's actually just replicated unit after unit after unit after unit.
Yeah, and I think this is, I guess, plays out when you go and look at the core, for instance, of most of our trades, that they all are the same. You know, they all have those sort of skills that you talked about, and they are all prerequisites. So you can't just simply go off and do turning. It has to have all this underpinning knowledge before you get to that point. And that sort of it's why the elective pool is the size that it is. It's the reason why the core is the size that it is. And we've grown the core in recent times from, I think it was 20 points a little while ago, and now we're up near 30 or so. And, you know, that's 30 or so out of 96 points. And then we've got to look at the trades and bringing things back to the vocation or the job. We really need to make sure that the units that are selected are identified and are relating to the job. Yeah, so that's something that I think as an ITAB, I'm going to have to go out there and start talking about more regularly about, you know, the reason why the structure has become what it is. One of the things that were thrown back to me when MEMR2 came out was that all these choices are now being taken away. And you can only do this trade if you select these units. And they said, well, that sort of puts out the opportunity for someone to learn something that doesn't actually exist in their workplace. And I said, exactly. The whole point of this is about marrying work to the skill, and you're training people to a vocation, not just to a learning opportunity. It's not like university where you're learning knowledge. You're actually applying skill. It's totally a different scenario.
And there's always the opportunity to import units. And we often get asked the question, you know, can we actually import this particular unit into this particular qualification?
Yeah.
So the first question that we always go through, is there a unit already in the trainee package that actually is actually pretty close to the unit that's actually being imported?
Yeah.
Quite often that is the case, and sometimes that's because we actually know the trainee package well, where we can say, okay, you want to bring that unit in, did you know that is actually covered in another unit?
Yeah.
Right? And then other times is want to bring a unit in, and you look at that particular unit of competency and go, well, how does that actually align to the definition of the qualification?
Yeah.
Right. So it still goes back to the definition of the qualification,
Yeah.
definition of the trade.
Yeah.
Right, on why it actually needs to actually be brought in.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's still nothing stopping somebody from training people in those particular things, you know, within the business.
Yeah, yeah. And look, I guess what the hang-ups are is they look at, well, this is what are we being funded for, and we want to add things in here and make them within the funded package. They don't want to say to an employer, look, if you want that, that's going to take an additional charge because it can't be made available within this package. Do you think employers would cope with that?
I think there'll probably be mixed views out there on that particular point.
Yeah.
But just coming back to what you were talking about with the prerequisites, you know, and the prerequisite paths of having increased with a lot of units of competency. And some of the reasons for that was the way that it was actually being some of it was actually being delivered.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, most profiles would have manual handling in there.
Yeah.
And we were finding manual handling was actually being delivered in the fourth year.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense. Why is that delivered in the fourth year?
Yeah.
Well, manual handling should be delivered very early on in an apprenticeship.
Is there any direction in, for instance, the companion volume to talk about the progress in which the units within a qualification should be delivered?
I mean, the only guideline is that you've actually got to do it prerequisites before you actually do the parent unit.
Yeah.
I mean, I see you know, transcripts where I see, you know, sort of, you know, fairly basic, you know, sort of, you know, core skills actually being delivered in the fourth year.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
So, okay, well, how about we make them prerequisites of the unit so they actually get delivered, you know, before the parent unit.
Yeah, some of the other craziness that I've seen is where they deliver a unit and it's got a prerequisite, they redo the prerequisite even though they've already delivered it. So they're continuing over and over again because they're scared of the auditor coming in and saying, oh, well, can you tell me that they've done this prerequisite? The idea of holistic learning and assessment hasn't quite taken its grip yet.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of that's actually driven by funding.
Yeah.
I mean, once the unit of competency's been actually ticked off, they get the points for it.
Yeah.
And that's actually, okay, well, now this unit's being delivered. We're worried about the auditor. We don't have the prerequisite.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on an hour, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
It's been great as an initial conversation. I'd really like to talk more. I think we could talk all day about some of this stuff. And maybe we can pick up some other topics. We've got things like industry-based assessment and all those sorts of things, and even what's going to happen now in the next tranche of the training package and some of the things that are coming down the pipeline. I'd like to maybe get yourself and Curry in the room together and talk about some of that stuff. I know you guys have been in this game for a damn long time, and some people would say probably too long.
Yeah, I know some do. And in some cases, I think we've actually forgotten more than what we actually currently know as well.
Yeah, well, I constantly say this to the people who I interview, is most of the people I interview have forgotten more than I know and probably ever will. And that's one of the impetuses for this podcast, is for me to start to collect that information. And I've always said to Fraser Nelson as an example is that I need to download as much of his information before he leaves us, not to wish him ill, but I think there's a real gap of knowledge that is existing. Do you think AI Group are going to bring an apprentice on for you to take some of your work on in the future?
We've tried a few times over the years. I'm not the only person in AI Group who sort of works in this particular space, but it's a challenging space. And what I mean by that is you've actually got to have a pretty good idea on what you're actually looking at.
Yeah.
So you have to I'm not saying you've got to be technically competent in all the units of competency, but you've got to have a pretty good idea, on what it is. And then you've also got to have a pretty good understanding of the industrial side of it as well.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, you've got an organisation protecting a payroll, and you got employees sort of trying to get a little bit more money in their whippy, and then you got egos involved.
Yeah.
And you got all those different nuances that you actually have to work with.
Trying to manage them. Yeah.
You want to try to get it on the same page. You'll never get everybody on the same point on that same page, but you're just trying to get everybody on the same page. Yeah. So, and some of the other people who I'm going to talk to as we go on through this podcast is like Richard Jenkins, who you probably are aware is now new chair of MSA, as the independent chair, sitting amongst the industrial organisations that are members of MSA. So there's some interesting people who we can talk to about some of this stuff and the history of it. And I think, we need to learn from the history. And that's the bit I think that is really difficult to pass on, is to, and you talked earlier about the intent of units. Unfortunately, when intent's not written down, it doesn't mean much. And to pass that knowledge on is I think, a very important thing. Yeah. And always just a little word of caution. We've still got to look through the front windscreen, not always look in the revision mirror as well.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. I don't know if you've seen some of the reviews that are coming out. There's some things at the moment, and I scratch my head a little bit wondering if they have either read history and they're going to bring back the past, or they have not learnt from history. So that's a problem as well. So happy to look out the front windscreen, but we need to make sure that we're not repeating the mistakes of the past.
Yeah, no, it'd be great. And I'd be more than happy to come back on.
That'd be great, David. Thanks very much, mate. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Cheers, Leon.
Cheers.